Well, it looks like we're already gathering quite a big group here, and we are 5 minutes on, so maybe I will start this session. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. We have another exciting session for all of you. I know this morning was already a very heavy morning with a lot of learning, and you were already starting to have quite a lot of questions about how are businesses actually tackling such a complex issue and how are they collecting this information for the statement. So this is the right session to try to answer those questions. And we have once again a stellar line of panelists that we are lucky enough to have with us today. And they will today tell us a little bit more how are they addressing the issue of modern slavery, what are some of the challenges that they're facing in trying to collect all this data, bringing in this perspective of businesses, but also we have technology providers who have been working for many years with businesses in trying to support them in collecting the information that they need and doing the due diligence required. So a lot, once again, a lot to learn today. And I also encourage you to put your questions in the chat as soon as you have any, so we can try to answer them at the end. But before starting the session fully, I would like to invite the speakers to introduce themselves briefly, and then we can start asking them to tell us a little bit more about their experience. So maybe if you don't mind, Charlotte, I would like to start with you, and then maybe you can pick another speaker to briefly introduce themselves. Thank you very much.
Sure. Hi, I'm Charlotte Gwynn, and I'm calling in from Perth in Western Australia. I work at Walk Free, which is a human rights organisation looking to accelerate an end to modern slavery. And I engage with governments and with businesses to try and drive better practices. Thanks. I'll hand to Clea.
Hi, I'm Clea Vazquez, and I work in a company called BIC Consolidated. We're a cleaning service provider nationally in Australia, and basically I am look at human rights issues from a risk lens, and that's part of what my team do in this space. So I'm hoping that I can share a little bit of information with everybody about what preparing a modern slavery statement looks like from a business perspective, especially a service providing organisation like a cleaning company. Handing over to Juan.
Maybe Saskia, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you from all over the world. My name is Saskia Kort-Chick. I am the CEO of the Telco Together Foundation, which is a charitable foundation located here in Melbourne, Australia, working with as the name suggests, telco industry. And we've got a couple of areas that we're focusing on, and modern slavery is one of them. How about Claire to go next?
Thanks, Saskia. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you. I'm joining from Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, the First Nations people of Australia. I'm the anti-slavery manager with the University of Sydney. So our team leads the university's response to addressing modern slavery risks across the products and services we buy, our research partners, but also supporting students that might be at risk of modern slavery. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. I'll hand over to Hannah.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah. I am the Director of Supply Chain Technology, Research and Development at Diginex. We develop tools and work with brands to help them to identify their supply chain partners, get visibility on their supply chain, understand working conditions, identify child labour, forced labour, and help them to remediate issues they find. I'll pass on to Nicholas.
Thanks, Hannah. Name is Nicholas Bernhardt. I'm calling in from beautiful Currumbin Valley in Queensland, and it's part of the Jugendbear Nation, and I am a founder and the CEO of Inform 365. We're an ESG tech company that help businesses navigate the ESG risks and transparency, and looking forward to these sessions with you. I did one little thing that I have to confess. I did come over from the dark side. I used to be an investment banker. I will hand over to who hasn't been yet. We've had Charlotte. I think Laureen, we haven't had you yet.
Thanks, Nicholas. Yes. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm calling in from Berlin, Germany. I work for WikiRate. I'm the advocacy director there, and we are an NGO that collects data on companies looking at their social and environmental impacts and actions. And together with Walk Free, we've done the largest assessment of modern slavery statements to date. So I think, was that just me, or should I hand over to anyone else?
I'll take you back from here, Laureen. Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for making the time to be here with us today and really help us understand this very important angle in addressing this big topic on how to develop AI solutions to assess the business's reports on modern slavery. And it would be such a disservice to all of us not to be able to understand exactly how those reports are being produced and what are some of the challenges or the opportunities in actually building these statements. So maybe we can start with you, Charlotte. You already presented this morning such a great overview of the statistics of modern slavery, and you're already nudging on the complexity of the supply chain and how many products are reaching developing countries through the supply chain of corporations being at risk of being made with forced labor. And then we're also discussing slowly a little bit about some of other legal mechanisms that are out there for governments from the modern slavery legislation, but we touch upon imports ban, for instance, in our discussion. So would you mind also, again, presenting to us a little bit more of a background on what is the role of businesses in addressing modern slavery, and maybe positioning us a little bit again on this legal landscape? Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for jumping the gun with my slides a little bit. Just super briefly, I'm from a group called Walk Free, and we're based in Perth, Western Australia, and our focus is on modern slavery. So as many of you would have heard in this morning's presentation, we produce something called the Global Slavery Index that helps us estimate the baseline of people who are in modern slavery globally, and it informs our advocacy work. So we work a lot with businesses and with governments. So in terms of like the role of business in addressing modern slavery, it's huge. Like, they can do a lot because they have workers, and most people in the world are workers. So they have a huge ability to impact the amount of people who are trapped in situations of forced labor. But they can't do everything, right? You need strong legislation. You need a great system, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later in terms of the legislative landscape. And I'm going to be doing this all in 10 minutes. So I'm going to speak quick, but feel free to pop any questions that come up into the chat as well. So businesses have a responsibility to identify and prevent, and then also remedy any harms that occur to workers in their own companies as a starting place, and in companies that they do businesses with. So their suppliers or their partners, otherwise known as supply chains. Firstly, I guess I'll just say, what do I mean by harm? I think consider that there's a spectrum of labor practices, and they range from decent work right there in the blue at the bottom, right through to modern slavery, which is the most egregious forms of labor exploitation. That includes things like forced labor, debt bondage, and those are both forms of modern slavery. But then in the middle there, you'll also see dangerous or substandard working conditions. So workers can technically leave work, for example, unlike they can in modern slavery, but they're just terrible working conditions. If you're an ethical company, then you have a responsibility to be addressing all those issues. So whether they're substandard working practices or modern slavery. Yeah, so I was trying to think about how to do this part, but I'm going to run you through what companies tend to do, like what they can do. So you can understand where they play in this ecosystem in terms of like tackling modern slavery and exploitation. Essentially, they should develop a really strong strategy for assessing and addressing modern slavery and its related risks. And then they can implement it by conducting risk assessments and due diligence, and also providing remediation when harms occur. They can do other things like, advocacy work with governments, engaging with suppliers, all of these things, but I'm just going to touch on the high level side of things today. So when I think about the theme of governance and policy within a business, then I'm talking about companies need to be able to assign a person who's responsible for addressing forced labor, so whether that's a person or a team, and they also need buy-in from the top. So it's really important that the board or the leadership team is really invested in addressing modern slavery within their organization. And oftentimes laws will make this happen. Not all the time, but when legislation comes in and companies are required to do things, then you really get that buy-in from the top. So after the responsibility is kind of assigned or given, then companies come up with a strategy. So they need a really clear plan of how they can identify modern slavery risks and address them. They then need policies that support that strategy, and then they need to implement all of those policies. So whether that means like giving training to everybody in your organization or everybody you trade with or partner with. And then finally reporting on if that strategy is working, how it's going. And that's reporting internally and then also externally. The next kind of big chunk of what they can do is conducting due diligence. It's a huge kind of area, but due diligence just means essentially looking after your workers and those that your work impacts and touches by preventing harm to them and also addressing any harm that comes their way because of something that you have been working on or required of them. So first of all, you really need to understand risk. A lot of companies do not understand what risks are, and then that makes it really difficult to address them. They can't do everything. One massive company can have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of suppliers if they're huge. So they can't do everything. So they need to prioritize really well where are the biggest areas of risk and how can I address those risks first before moving outwards from there. And starting with your own organization, what's going on within your business, what are you doing? What could you be doing better to protect workers? Are you remunerating all your workers fairly? And if not, that's where you should start. And then from then you move on into your supply chains. These are the International Labour Organization's indicators of forced labor. So there's 11 different indicators here. And these are things that companies can look for. They should be real red flags to try and understand if a person could be in a situation of forced labor where they cannot refuse the work that they're doing. It's not always easy to see at first. If you just go into a factory, for example, you see people working, right? But how you have to dig a little bit deeper to try and understand, are they there from choice? Are they free to leave that place? Are they being paid fairly? Are they being asked to do things that they otherwise wouldn't? So first of all, being the abuse of vulnerability, that looks at exploiting workers who are especially vulnerable due to factors like poverty or migration status, for example. Are workers being deceived? Were they recruited through false promises of the nature of their job or their working conditions? Third, the restriction of movement on workers. If you're controlling a worker's movement within a workplace or preventing them from leaving the worksite or accommodation, that's a huge indicator of modern slavery, of forced labor, right? You're not allowing them to leave. Isolation, so if somebody's physically or socially isolated, if they're in a remote location, for example, or if their contact is restricted with other people, that's a huge red flag here. Physical and sexual violence, obviously people know what that is. And then intimidation and threats, so the use of threats, for example, a migrant worker, somebody might say to them, we will deport you or you will lose your job if you don't complete X, Y, Z for us. And we may or may not pay you, those kinds of threats. Retention of identity documents, that's a huge way to control a worker's movements. Withholding of wages, this is the deliberate underpayment or non-payment of wages to keep workers dependent and prevent them from leaving. Debt bondage is itself a form of modern slavery, and this is where you force workers to continue to work in order to repay a debt, and that debt might often be inflated or never clearly defined, and the worker can't leave until it's repaid. Abusive working living conditions, these are degrading, to the worker or unhealthy, and they violate their dignity and their rights. And finally, excessive overtime. So forcing workers to work extremely long hours beyond legal or agreed upon limits, under threats, or without proper compensation. So those are some of the things that companies can be looking out for. Just for the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail on all of these things, but perhaps I can share these slides afterwards, just so that you can understand the kinds of like higher risk groups of people, like workers or partners that companies could be working with, or the work arrangements that can lead to more exploitative arrangements, and also countries where suppliers might be located, for example, or where work might be ongoing. These would be things that should come up in a company's risk assessment, so they can say, okay, these are the higher risk work arrangements. Like, I'm going to start by prioritizing my efforts over here and focusing on these groups of people and these groups of workers, and making sure that they are all protected and being and engaging in decent work. So essentially, companies will conduct these risk assessments and then respond to what they find. They respond through grievance mechanisms. So companies have in place oftentimes, and should have in place according to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, grievance mechanisms. This is a way for workers to raise a grievance if something is going wrong at work, if they're not being paid, if they're being abused. If they have no way of reporting that, then the companies will never know. So it's like a baseline of transparency that you need to have some way for workers to be contacting you and sharing their their concerns. And I'm sure some of the other speakers will go into this in more detail, what that looks like in practice. And finally, remediation. So when something does go wrong, how are companies providing remedy? They need to be prepared. Prepared to respond and make good that situation again. Oftentimes it looks like financial compensation, but it can also look like providing medical support, maybe repatriating workers that have been exploited. Or if it's a smaller thing, say somebody has not been paid any wages for excessive work hours they were working, then it can be remuneration and they will stay as a worker there. And that's all about kind of engaging with workers and ensuring that they are satisfied with that form of remedy that you're providing. So that's kind of what businesses can do. That's like within their control, if that makes sense. I think this morning people heard from, it was called Session 0. So that was about the modern slavery acts that are in place. So you've heard a lot of detail on those particular laws. So I'm going to move past those ones and just share a little bit further on the two other kinds of buckets of these corporate reporting laws, corporate laws. What do I call them? Transparency, corporate reporting laws. How's that? Very catchy. So the first one, you've heard about that. That's essentially many countries enacted legislation requiring companies just to disclose on their efforts to combat modern slavery within their operations and supply chains. I think one of the key weaknesses with these laws at the moment is that, transparency is one thing, but a company could be doing nothing or not much, and they could state that, and that statement would still comply. So these laws across the board, I think in all the places they're in place, they lack enforcement mechanisms or penalties. Fortunately, there are some indicators that this will change soon as the acts are being reviewed and strengthened. The next kind of bucket is forced labor import bans. Currently, the US have a couple of laws that prevent the importation of goods and that are mined or produced or manufactured wholly or in part by forced labor. And there's something called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this one is interesting because it's based on the presumption that any goods produced in the Xinjiang region in China or by entities linked to forced labor are inadmissible to the US market because there's been so many documented abuses and forced labor in that particular region. This has been pretty well enforced. Many shipments have been detained, and the US government have an entity list, which essentially is a prohibited company list. So anybody on that list cannot import anything into the US. The importers then have to engage with customs and be able to provide convincing evidence that the goods aren't tainted by forced labor in order for the goods to be released. So obviously that's a huge deterrent for companies sourcing from that particular region. And it's a massive incentive to map supply chains and conduct due diligence so that the importers can demonstrate they've made all these efforts to avoid using forced labor and get those goods released as soon as they can. Excitingly, the EU is introducing similar legislation that I forgot to check. I think it comes into force by next December. But it's even stronger because not only are goods prevented from entering, but also from moving around within the European market and from moving out of the market, so being exported. So it's a lot more comprehensive. It will be hard to enforce. We'll see how it's enforced. But companies will essentially, as a result, be forced to map and assess and mitigate against risks to avoid any holdups on imports or exports, which, as you imagine, would be incredibly detrimental for any company or any importer. And the final kind of bucket here is human rights due diligence requirements. These refer to laws that obligate companies to assess and address human rights in their supply chains and on an ongoing basis. So the companies need to disclose the plans that they have to identify and to prevent risks and to address them. Those are currently in place in France and Germany and Netherlands particularly looks at child labor, if any goods have been manufactured with child labor. And that's actually a far larger bucket than goods with forced labor because there's a larger number of child laborers in the world than people who are in forced labor, if that makes sense. So those are the kind of three main buckets. They're three different mechanisms. They're kind of like different levers that have a similar goal because they all are encouraging businesses to have responsible practices embedded in their operations and supply chains, and then particularly when sourcing or importing goods. Yeah, it's interesting to see which is most impactful. I guess it's good to have the whole kind of ecosystem there. Each uses a slightly different approach, but they all aim to ensure that companies are preventing that harm, respecting human rights, and are accountable for their supply chains. Anyway, I better leave it there. I've probably taken more than my time. Thanks, Adriana.
No, thank you, Sharon. Thank you for taking the time and giving us such a good understanding of what is expected from businesses and what are some of the indicators businesses are looking for, and also to situate a bit more the Modern Slavery Acts into the larger regulatory framework, because this really helps us to see that the work that we're doing here with these modern slavery statements sets the precedent to helping the other governments that have other laws that have reporting obligation or any data that needs to be verified in order to be enforced, to help them enforce these laws using technology. So I think that that's very, very important. And Laureen, you've mentioned in your introductions that you've been working for many years with Walk Free, and for so many years you've been collecting data on businesses, but also particularly modern slavery statements and analyzing them. Would you mind sharing a little bit from your experience on what is the process of trying to collect all this data from companies and some of the challenges in assessing the statements, and where do you see maybe AI helping in the future with this? Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Adriana. And I hope my voice holds out, so please bear with me if I have a little cough in between. But yeah, so we're going to be zooming in particularly on these transparency reporting legislation that Charlotte just mentioned. And I'm glad to hear that you already had a session that did a deep dive, so I don't need to go into all of that. But before I get into that, I just briefly want to explain a little bit about WikiRate just so that you have the context of who we are and why we do this type of work. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, WikiRate is a platform that collects data on companies, but the key there is that it's not proprietary. So a lot of these data collectors and providers, they sell this data mostly to investors, and we actually do that for the public good, as a public good. So it's free for anyone to access and work with. The data focuses on like a range of social and environmental issues, and it's really always been a thing for us to, as Charlotte also was talking about, you have a lot of these policies and commitments and governance things that companies talk about, but we're always looking for how can we find the evidence on the ground to show that they're walking the talk. And yeah, it's been an interesting experience, let's put it that way, to see if we can get to that kind of insights. For the UK and Australian Modern Slavery Acts, the work was really focused on, like yeah, the law, quite frankly put, doesn't have a lot of teeth because of the lacking enforcement that is there. And so the work with Walk Free, once we started in 2016, so in 2015 the first UK Act came into being, and in 2016 our work started. And really the idea was like, how can we create more accountability through this work if the government haven't really thought through or hasn't really prepared itself for doing that well. So it was just about getting a sense of what's in these documents. And companies have come a long way, I have to say, since then, and still there is a very long way to go. I won't go into detail about what the findings are, because I know one of my colleagues will be in a later session and she'll be talking more about that. But what I can say is a little bit more about the process of how we go about doing this type of data collection and analysis. So the first step is to find the reports, right? And initially, there was no government registries or portals where you could download reports. That came on later. So it really started out with just Google searches to find these reports. And there was a piece in the law that said, okay, companies need to have this, an accessible link on their homepage. But, you know, most companies didn't. So we would have to really go and search through lots of different pages. And also the idea of a company, when I say Coca-Cola, we all think of the one, but it's not like that. Companies exist of many, many entities, hundreds, sometimes thousands, and they often all own pieces of each other, and they apply to different jurisdictions. And these laws apply to specific jurisdictions. So you need to first find out which company would be the one that is actually accountable to this legislation, then try to find their website, which they might not have their own website. They might be lumped into the group website, and then you need to go and find that statement. So it was a very, we always say, this is the worst part of the research. This is the spaghetti mess that we have to untangle. And then, you know, we would even write to companies emails, like a PR person, you know, any email you can find with the Freedom of Information Act request to send us their report. So this is a very complicated process. And yeah, then the registries came into being, which is great because it meant we could just kind of download and export these lists of statements. But what was tricky there is that you're still dealing with issues like, are these all the companies that should be reporting? Because governments did not want to produce lists of all the companies that have to have a report because they weren't sure because of this spaghetti mess. So that was a big thing for them to state. So they didn't. So they rather not burn their hands on that. And so we would need to really think through, okay, if we're going to look at the apparel sector, what companies are actually within the scope of this legislation? So we would have to do research around the scope and then try and find them and find their subsidiaries and on and on and on. And then ultimately, you're also trying to translate that to your audience. They might not know if I'm going to talk about Bev, you know, like some complicated name of a subsidiary. They just want to hear Coca-Cola. So you also need to constantly have this like high level and detailed perspective and translate between the two and make sure you're not kind of like mismatching things. Because the wonderful thing is also that what companies do is that, for instance, you could have Puma Grease or Carrefour Grease or something like that. And that used to be part of the Carrefour group, which is French, but they sold them this Greek subsidiary to a Greek company, and they decided to keep the name because that brand was really strong. So there's all of these things that you need to untangle before you can even get into assessing the documents. So then when you get to the research itself, in the early days, we really had to go through a manual process. So right now we're looking at a very different reality, of course, with all the AI solutions that are coming in, and we can talk more about that in a bit. But when we started, it was really, we created a question and answer list where we worked with university groups and volunteer researchers to help us assess these documents, as many as we could, because our teams, you know, if we look at the number of companies that fall within the scope of these legislations, it was like 16,000 reports coming out each year. We've done the largest assessment, and we're not even near to assessing all of these companies every single year, right? So we would just have to try and scale our research capacity, and we did that through this kind of crowdsourcing method, and that, yeah, has been a really good experience, but it is also a complicated thing because these are legal documents, and so the language that companies use can be very roundabout. They can kind of talk around the point. They can drop all the right terms, but not really say what you're hoping them to say or want them to say. So it's this kind of really active and critical thinking that is needed to actually do these types of assessments and really tease out, is the company actually doing this, or are they acknowledging that they should be doing this or that they will be doing this in the future, right? So it's this kind of language that we really had to be very mindful of. Yeah, and then also it's this kind of tension between, can we figure out what companies are saying, and can we and that what they're actually doing? Can we find the evidence? So if they're talking about all this amazing due diligence work that they're doing to assess their risk and to find out and to go to do site visits, are they actually telling us about cases of forced labor that they found? Because we know the issue is so widespread that practically every company will have issues in their supply chains. Maybe some closer, maybe some further, but they will. And so if your due diligence is thorough enough, you should find issues. And so it's also this kind of flipping of, if we find an issue, it's actually a good thing because it means your system is working. And that's very different from some other types of reporting. So yeah, that just gets into some of the challenges that we see there. AI, Adriana came into our lives and turned everything upside down and said, well, if you can teach, a crowd to do this, surely I can teach a computer how to do this. So we really embarked on this wonderful AIMS project, and since then AI has developed very quickly as well, and we're seeing more and more of AI tools coming into helping with the assessment of these things. That is not as simple as it seems, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But before I hand over to the next speaker, I just want to quickly go on a little sidestep to sketch a little bit more about the legal situation that we're in right now, because the political situation has changed quite a lot in the last 2 years. In both the US and the EU, we're seeing a lot of pressure on these transparency reporting laws, in particular, to water them down. And I want to talk a little bit briefly about why that is impacting the social reporting more than environmental reporting. So environmental reporting, if I'm looking at emissions, it's the type of reporting all investors, and they're often the key audience in mind for policymakers when they develop this kind of legislation. It's easy. It's often numerical. It's numbers. And if you have high emissions, that's bad. If you have low emissions, that's good. And it's very clear. And you pick a methodology, you calculate the number, and there you go. That's it. When it comes to these social reporting, it's very hard to find the information. So let's say I'm doing an audit of a factory, and I mean, the other speakers will tell you in much more detail how this actually works, but I might have to go to a factory that's in the middle of nowhere. I need to take a plane to a deserted airstrip. Of course, the factory ownership is going to know when I'm going to arrive. And the children who might work there usually will not be there when I get there, right? So it becomes this very complex issue to actually get a grip on, much more than emissions, where, it's being calculated and you just source it from your different departments. And if you do actually manage through all the work that you do to find these issues, this idea of, I found it, that's great, it's an accomplishment, is not really always landing with the audience. Investors might not really like the idea that you found forced labor because it can be a risky thing to talk about, or a government might actually have something in place that keeps you liable for these things. So it becomes a much more messy thing and risky thing for companies to talk about. And through the years, we've heard from a lot of legal departments that it's a battle with the legal department of what they are able and are not able to say in these documents through this reporting. So taking that into account, we're seeing now in this kind of push where, to be frank, the private sector is having a stronger and more heard voice at the moment than civil society in the legislative space. We're seeing a pressure on these reporting laws to be watered down, and actually to, especially on the social reporting, revert back to more qualitative reporting, where they can have narratives about what they do and what they're finding, rather than this very standardized reporting, numbers, categories, and things that we can compare between companies. So we're working hard to avoid a situation where we know even less about these issues than we do already now. And I'll leave it there, Adriana.
Thank you. No, thank you so much, Laureen. Thank you for bringing these two important pillars. First, on how challenging it is to collect this data. It sounds so simple, and I'm glad that you brought in this perspective, because even in one of our challenges, we have a small request that the governments have asked us, which is, the companies are sending us the reports to the registry, but by law, they're also required to put that on their website. Can the participants just check if the company published this statement on their website? And I promise you, it's going to be more challenging than it seems, because sometimes the company uses the same link every year, so they're losing all the historical statements. And now there are so many blockers to scrape the company's websites because of all these AI agents and so on. So just a thing that seems so simple, just collecting the statements before analyzing, it can take so long. So thank you for bringing us to this reality. And secondly, thank you for also explaining that these laws are not statics, they are changing. And that's why it's so important that we adapt and we bring all this domain expertise together with the data expertise in how to adjust and be able to keep progressing the vision. So thank you, Laureen, for this. And we talked about the statements. So I'm really excited to invite Clea now. And Clea, you've been the head of risk. You had to build a modern slavery statement. Tell us, what does it take to be able to collect this information? How does a big corporation like yours or a big company like yours even starts when you heard that this is the law and now you have to put a statement? Where do you start? What do you have to do? Thank you.
Thank you for asking, Adriana. I just wanted to circle back a little bit more so that people understand a bit more about the company that I work in. So, as I mentioned before, we're based in Australia. We have head offices in Sydney and Melbourne. We are a national cleaning company, so we provide cleaning services with workforces that can be migrant workers, that are people with multiple languages. It can in some parts of our business be a bit of a transient workforce, and especially in the time of COVID, we did have a lot of moving pieces, I guess, in that space. So if we sort of understand what the company is, we had about 3,000 plus employees at the time, and around about 50 suppliers. And now we're a company of about 6,000, almost 6,500 employees. And we have, compared to other companies, a small number of suppliers, about 100, but still for us, it's double what we had before. But back to your question, which was around, the development of an initial modern slavery statement and what that means to an organization. The work in that space came into my team, and to be honest, at the time, the first thing that we had to do, or that I especially had to do, was do a lot of research. So looking at what our competitors were doing in that space, looking at what our clients are doing in that space, and trying to find information on our suppliers as well, just meant reading a lot of information online, even completing courses that developed my skill set in the modern slavery space, just trying to take on as much information as I possibly can to give our business the most education and knowledge in that space so that we could start to build what we needed to build. We also partnered with organisations like the Cleaning Accountability Framework, which is called CAF in Australia, and another company called the Property Council of Australia, and definitely, which I mentioned before, working closely with partners like the UN Global Compact to really get a handle on what it is we need to be understanding, and how we need to source that information. And then the next step from there, after trying to be as educated in the space as possible, is going back in and having a deep look at your suppliers. And the way that we did that was, initially it was quite overwhelming actually, because you understand your suppliers as, where you get your goods and services from. But this changed the dynamic of how the organization looked at our suppliers and our supply chain, and how we then had to map out what we could as best understand from those suppliers. But even with that, there was challenges, because it was around building the appropriate information into questionnaires to send out to suppliers, inputting or embedding the right kinds of questions to have in meetings with our suppliers, making sure that those questionnaires even get to the correct people within organizations, because as you can imagine, sometimes the email address that you have as a point of contact for a supplier is not always a person that has the knowledge or the depth and breadth of knowledge that you need to have to answer that information that you need to receive back from your suppliers. So it was, and still is in some ways, I must admit, but it was initially when first trying to set up an understanding of our supply chains and where they may be importing goods from, and other questions that we needed to understand about them. It was quite challenging. But this was, even though it was a challenge, it was also a blessing, because the more we understood about our suppliers, the more we could then partner with our suppliers to help them on the journey of really understanding modern slavery or human rights due diligence in their workspaces, which again, anyway, that's a little bit further along in sort of my explanation. And then from there, it's really just trying to build out the data that you've collated from your suppliers and also from your own organisation internally into responding appropriately to the criteria that's requested by, obviously the expectations of the modern slavery statement itself. And just circling back actually to the team that's on this panel, we did definitely use the Walk Free Global Slavery Index to review our suppliers against, to do a risk assessment of our suppliers, looking at the top imported products at risk of modern slavery, top countries at risk of modern slavery, and then risk assessing the answers that our supply chain came back to us with, our suppliers against that data, which again was a process that we hadn't completed before, which allowed us to really recognise where are the goods and where are the services for us are actually coming from Australia. So that's not really what we're talking about right now, but it's the products that are actually used to provide those services. So if we're talking about, cleaning chemicals, consumables, PPE, those are the sorts of things that we need to think about in the cleaning space. And then from there, writing up the actual statement, as I was mentioning before, so talking to the criteria. Each different criteria within that statement has to be addressed and responded to. Criteria 1 and 2 is around, identifying the reporting entity and also describing the entity structure, operations and supply chains. And as I explained, that we're a commercial cleaning company, so the types of services that we supply are around waste, recycle management, commercial cleaning services, those kinds of services. I'm not going to go into deep detail, but that's what we do and how we do it. Window cleaning, different types of specialist and periodical cleaning. And the specific types of products that we have in our supply chains are things like cleaning supplies, PPE, uniforms, plant and equipment, consumables, IT and communication devices, office supplies, vehicles, those kinds of things. Interestingly, the countries that we get products from, we do have a lot of products coming from Australia, and even more so now with our interest in social impact. But again, that's initially we weren't aware of everything that we were doing, and I guess our supply chain, the different countries as part of our supply chain was broader. So looking at that, and then in criteria 3, describing the risks of modern slavery. So recognising that in the cleaning industry and other industries in Australia, like the security industry, there can be, quite a large focus on those industries being service providing industries and having particular dynamic of workforce. So the government itself actually has focused on there being significant or key risks of modern slavery in those types of workforces. But because of that, we were able to partner with particular organisations that had that focus, and then work with those organisations to complete audits within our own workplaces to then, from a social auditing perspective, to then also reaffirm and justify that there was no modern slavery within our actual service sites within Australia, which again was something that we as a business were able to pivot and work with our partners to help us complete those, which was really, really good. And talking to actions, so criteria 4 is describing actions taken by the entity to actually control and assess and address risks. So controlling and assessing and addressing risks of modern slavery is actually also looking at just a general risk of human rights, because modern slavery is part of recognizing, risk to people within your organization. And our business is constantly doing that through the types of assessments that we're doing, the discussions that we're having, etc. So we were lucky to have quite a large body of work in that space to be able to, report for our statement. But again, by reporting through our modern slavery statement, we're able to develop and mature as an organisation in those spaces as well. So just another benefit of being part of this ongoing process of, investigation, review and monitoring internally, but also within your supply chains. And as I was explaining before, sort of our business started off with, let's look at questionnaires. But what has actually happened is it's now strengthened our organisation to be able to have ongoing monitoring and discussions with our suppliers around particular touch points that we need to understand from a modern slavery and human rights perspective. And I also just wanted to add that another really important part, as has been discussed already by Lauren, was talking to grievance mechanisms and remedy. And maybe with some organisations that are starting off at first, you have an internal escalation process, you have an internal grievance mechanism process, which could be informal or formal, but that then develops into not only a whistleblower process, but internally, but then also a third party process, and then a significant remedy process that sits within that too. So I guess what I'd like to share in summary is that going through the process of setting up and discovering information about your own business and your supply chain and building a modern slavery statement was initially quite overwhelming, but it's such a critical and crucial part of our organisation to continuously improve and also build other mechanisms to support not only our organisation and our people, but also people within our supply chain. And that's the important reason why, or the work that everybody that's hopefully listening to this, but also that Adriana and the other panelists that you'll hear from today and have heard from today, the work that's being done in this space is so important for every person, but also every business.
Thank you so much, Clea, for your contribution. And lucky enough, our participants now are getting quite a good understanding of how modern slavery looks like. Even this morning, they've learned about the cleaning sector as being and some of the risk associated with that. And then we had a session where we went through the reporting criteria of the legislation and a template that the three governments put together. So thank you so much for addressing each of the criteria one by one, and really providing the example on how our business is approaching each of the criteria and some of the challenges with that. So thank you for running us through that process and through a methodology that the participants are now familiar with. And I would like now to turn to Clare, because we also have a really interesting perspective to bring in. Universities are maybe at times not thought about as being responsible, being kept to the same level of responsibility as businesses. But in fact, universities have a lot of purchasing power. They're responsible for the livelihood of so many people. So we are really excited to have Clare with us today to bring us to us the perspective of how is a large university such as Sydney University addressing the challenges on identifying their own risk of modern slavery and building the modern slavery statements. And Clare, do you have any particular case study that you can show us on how you're really approaching the risk identification process? Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana, and hi again, everyone. So yes, I'm from the University of Sydney in Australia, and I think that's a really good point, Adriana, that often universities are maybe not considered in the same realm as businesses, but under Australia's Modern Slavery Act, we're required to report just like any large business. So we have to put forward an annual modern slavery statement and respond to the mandatory reporting criteria that Clea's just gone through. So I will share a case study today, and I thought I might talk a little bit about some of the challenges in responding to modern slavery risks across the university. And we have quite a complex environment at the university. And so I think there's quite a lot of opportunities for AI to support some innovations in the approach that we take, that some of you might get thinking about as part of this hackathon. So I'll just start by maybe setting the scene and giving you a bit of a picture for those that aren't familiar with the University of Sydney. So we're Australia's oldest university. This year is actually our 175th anniversary, which, if there's anyone from Europe on the call, we seem like babies, but in Australia, that's old for a university. We have 70,000 students and 30,000 staff. We have 9 teaching and research locations, including a campus in regional Australia. We have a research station on the Great Barrier Reef, and we have a centre in China and in Vietnam. We have thousands of partners, both in Australia and internationally, across both of our research and education. We spend more than $1 billion every year on our procurement, on buying goods and services, just to keep the university running. We source those from over 10,000 suppliers from close to 150 countries. So we operate very similarly in many of those respects to a big business in terms of our footprint for our supply chain. And maybe a little bit different to some businesses, given the nature of what universities do, we source everything from cadavers and human tissues for medical research to your more usual catering and office equipment for our faculties and schools. Just last month, I had a call about a number of people that the university was looking to employ to shear sheep on our regional campus, and would there be any concerns around modern slavery or labour risks. So we get a real diversity in the types of issues that we're looking at. And I think Clea summed it up well in saying that overwhelm is probably the word. That was what we initially experienced. So our team was set up to respond to the university's requirements under Australia's Modern Slavery Act. And I guess, how did we approach this really quite complex environment? So we started by doing an organisation-wide risk assessment and focusing really in on where we have salient risks within the university context, and then looking at where we have capacity or we have leverage to address those risks through our own due diligence practice. So I'm not going to go into that in a whole lot of detail. I want to touch more on one example today, just given the amount of time that we have. So I thought I would focus on a lot of procurement that we've done recently of solar panels across the university. So the university a number of years ago set a renewable energy target that we would source 100% of our energy needs from renewables by this year, 2025. So over the past few years, the university's been installing solar panels on over 30 buildings across campus. And so our team was brought in to address some of the modern slavery risks that are involved in solar panels. So for those that aren't aware, and I'll just go into this briefly, the solar supply chain is highly reliant on the Xinjiang region in China for both raw materials and manufacturing of solar panels and components. And there are significant risks of forced labour within that region. And Charlotte touched on this a little bit earlier, that now some experts suggest that if you are sourcing from that region or sourcing components from that region, given how pervasive the risks are, it is very likely that the product you're sourcing will be tainted with forced labour. That's been recognised by the US with the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act that Charlotte went into. So when we approached solar panel procurement for the university, one of the key elements of our approach was focusing on supply chain traceability. So we looked at what was in our realm of control that we could do, and we wanted to try and avoid as much as possible sourcing components for panels or panels themselves from the Xinjiang region, or from suppliers where we know they had known reports of human rights violations. There's been quite a lot of public reporting in this area, and there have been a number of companies that have been implicated in forced labour concerns. So we required our supplier or suppliers now to provide a fully traceable solar panel. So they provide us with documentation of every supplier from the polysilicon, which is the key raw material that goes into the panel, up until the assembled panel. And then that gives us really good visibility across the whole supply chain. And we're able to use that information to identify, first of all, do we have any exposure to the Xinjiang region? And can we address that? But also, are we potentially sourcing from suppliers where there are known risks or issues? And then we can engage with our supplier to address those, or find alternative supply where that's possible and it's appropriate to do so. So that's one element of our approach. And the supply chain traceability, when we first started this back in 2022, the first traceability document that we received was an Excel spreadsheet. It was all in Chinese, and it was hundreds of rows of data that we were unable to, we couldn't understand. So that was our kind of starting point. We've learned a lot since then, and now we're receiving traceability documentation that we assess with every single shipment of panels that comes into the university, and we check that against a number of sources and engage with our supplier on that. And it's been a really good tool to raise our suppliers' awareness around these issues, why supply chain transparency, which was touched on earlier, is so important. And also to engage with them on some of the issues and the steps that we can put in place, the due diligence that we can put in place. What's an added layer of complexity in the university context is that solar panels doesn't just stop in our procurement for our own energy supplies. We also do research in innovation in solar panels. And so we also have several research partners that are either solar panel companies or startups in solar, but also might be sourcing components or panels for research projects at the university. So now we are working on rolling that approach out, looking at supply chain traceability and looking at enhanced due diligence also with our research partners that are doing, doing research in solar panels. Because I guess, we really need to actually walk the talk. We can't be saying we're doing this in our procurement, but then doing a whole lot of research in this space where we're not addressing these risks, which would be just as concerning. So I'm happy to talk in more detail later if you have questions about that example, but that's just to provide you with one example. And I think from that, what I wanted to do was pull 3 key challenges where I really see from our perspective as a university, where there could be opportunities for AI to support some of those challenges in addressing modern slavery across a large, complex organisation like ours. So the first is around consistency. So how do we ensure we have a consistent approach to due diligence checks across our organisation? So in some cases, we might be dealing with the same organisation, both within our procurement, but also as a research partner. So how can we make sure that we're engaging with them in a consistent way when we might be dealing with multiple teams across the university? And how can we make sure that we're, applying our validation of data, our assessment of, say, their modern slavery statements? How can we make sure we're applying that consistently? The second challenge is around scale, which I think is an obvious one, but a really challenging one. So how do we scale our due diligence approach without losing the targeted and deep approach that we need to address some of these risks? So there's really good evidence now that we need to take an approach that's targeted to the most salient risks within our organisation. That's international standards like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's the best practice approach. But for an organisation like ours, large and complex organisation, we also need to consider, how do we do this systematically across our organisation so we don't have gaps? For example, we're only addressing risks for solar panels within our procurement, but not with our research partners. But how do we do that in a way that then addresses solar has very specific risks? So we want to tailor our due diligence approach, not just roll something out that's standard across the whole organisation. And that's hard to do at scale in a way that's meaningful. And then just finally, because I'm conscious of time, we can go into this more in the Q&A, but the third challenge that I wanted to highlight was around measuring impact. And I don't think this is necessarily a challenge for a large organization. Many organizations find this really challenging in this space. When we're talking about measuring the impact of our actions on people that might be several steps removed from what we're doing. So often the people that we're trying to impact, the people that might be harmed, might be very far down the supply chain and not necessarily with our direct suppliers, where we don't have a lot of visibility. But we need to make sure that what we're doing actually does have impact on them. Otherwise, why are we doing it? So the impact measurement question, I think, is a really crucial one, really key challenge. And then maybe from a more practical kind of systems perspective, for large organization in particular, what kind of metrics or processes, what data collection do we need to measure impact at scale? Again, going back to that question of, we would have solar panels across our procurement, across our research partners. We have thousands of partners, 10,000 suppliers. How can we ensure that we're measuring impact with each of those where we are taking action across the whole organization? Because that's ultimately, that's a test of our effectiveness, but it's also what goes into our annual modern slavery statement. So I might leave it there. Hand back to you, Adriana. Happy to answer any more questions later in the Q&A.
Thank you so much,
you.
Claire. And I'm really glad we had this opportunity to dive into these two particular case studies, because I hope the participants can now understand that while we analyze thousands of statements, when we look at each individual document from a business, there is a huge team like yourselves trying to answer all these complex questions in order to collect this information. And while overwhelming, I think summarizes very well. Luckily, there are experts and institutions out there that are working with businesses, and we have three incredible next speakers that are going to show us some of their work in this field and how they are supporting businesses to try to address this issue. So I would like to invite Nicholas to tell us more about the work that Inform 365 is doing, and also you've been working with so many businesses, what it is that it works, and what are some of the lessons that you think participants can take away from your work. Thank you so much, Nicholas.
Thanks, Adriana. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes and yes.
Perfect. Yes and yes is excellent. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. So legislation comes out. In this case, we're talking about the Modern Slavery Act. There's also other ESG legislations coming down the pipeline or already have been passed, like the climate-related financial disclosures. Now, let's hone in on the Modern Slavery Act. When a legislation comes in for businesses, there are financial and reputational risks. Those are two of the challenges. Now, with the Modern Slavery Act, and I think it was Charlotte that mentioned, there's no penalties. So if I'm an organization, do I really feel inclined to even publish a statement? And to use Laureen's perfect term for this, it's a spaghetti mess. We don't even know who needs to report in Australia at this point in time. And just to give a little bit of a detail there, The Guardian published a report, I think about a week or so ago, where they suspect there's between 400 to 1,000 entities in Australia that are not publishing an annual modern slavery report because they go, hey, if I don't and you don't catch me, nothing will happen to me. So that's sort of around modern slavery. Now, the companies that are taking this seriously, what do they need to do? Well, they have to set up some internal systems. So you've got management involved, you've got the ESG team, you've got procurement, you've got tech, you've got internal data, you have external data, and then throw into the mix AI as well. So you've got a huge cocktail bubbling along there with literally tons of moving parts, and try and sort of make sense of that. As we've heard from some of the previous speakers, it's not easy, especially when you start out from pretty much ground zero, which was the case for most organizations in Australia. Now, Add to that most organizations aren't flush with resources in this space. So there's an 0.2 FTE working on the Modern Slavery Act compliance. If you're lucky, it might be one or a multiple of one. So there's those challenges as well. And at the end of the day, the whole sort of response to it is a function of budgets, the management's approach to it, and how a company wants to sort of be perceived. Some actually don't care how they're perceived. They'll just publish a marketing brochure, and that's pretty much it, with high-vis people pointing at things in the distance. I mentioned some few resources, so I'll go to some solutions now. And here's maybe a very good example of best practice and what actually works in this world. We were fortunate enough to team up with the Property Council of Australia 6 years ago. It's almost 7 years ago now, where we, together with, it was at the time 4 pioneering companies, set up the very first modern slavery consortium of its kind in the world. Turn the clocks forward 6 years or 6.5 years, it has now over 50 members, this consortium, with $2.3 trillion of assets under management. So a huge buying group there just to support those assets. Why did they get together? Well, we've sort of teased it out already. If you're on your own, you lack resources. It is a common challenge, and let's face it, it's pretty much a non-compete space. Unless you're one of the bad guys and you're profiting from modern slavery, you want to get rid of modern slavery. So let's work together. It was interesting, in one of the founding conference meetings, one of the members, or the founding members, said, look, and I'll mention this company because it's actually a good story for them. It was Stockland. They said, look, in Australia, Stockland, pretty well-known brand, if we ask our suppliers to do something in a particular way, yeah, we'll be listened to. But if we go overseas, Stockland's just one of a million companies that are buying goods out of the Asia Pac region. So over there, we have no pull whatsoever. But if we pull 50 plus organizations into a consortium with $2.3 trillion under management, that has much more impact as well. Even better story now, the consortia sort of model has grown. We've got now over 100 organizations in these various consortia, and it is driving efficiency through data sharing and collaboration. So let's go a little bit into the benefits. And I think these are sort of, I mean, they're pretty much self-explanatory. Collective leverage, I've mentioned that one already. Efficiency is a big one. You share costs for audits. You share best practice as well. Claire, you mentioned solar. Solar was a big problem for property companies as well 2 years ago. So they commissioned a whole bunch of experts to come up with what makes a solar panel not have modern slavery in it. And the sort of quintessential message 2.5 years ago is you pay a premium of about 25%, and then you're pretty certain that you will not have modern slavery components in that particular panel. There's also advocacy. The Property Council has been very strong on this in this area. And so that drives change as well, because they influence politics as well. And for organizations like that, they are showing true leadership. So there's really no downsides to working with your peers. And I don't even say peers, I also will mention competitors. So in these groups, we have companies that are competing with each other in a very, very competitive industry, but they're working together to try and bring about better outcomes. Now, that's all the rosy side of it. Let's look at some of the limitations. Now, being brutally blunt, and things are getting better, but there are still significant data gaps. There's data sometimes isn't that great. There's a lot of self-reported information. There's reliance on incomplete information. There is very limited visibility beyond tier 1. And being brutally blunt, when we started out, if someone or one of our clients or anyone that talked to us had a bit of visibility in tier 1, they already were ahead of the pack. And so to look even beyond that is hard, even harder. What has happened then, there's been a bit of a proliferation of technology and algorithms, and I call it smoke and mirrors. I'm being a bit disrespectful here, but it's sort of pretending we have clarity into the lower tiers when it's very hard to sort of get that actual clarity. I'll give you an example. If there was, say, Adriana, you're running an electrical company, and I tell you, hey, Adriana, you have a risk in Indonesia in rubber. What are you going to do with that information? It's your tier 8. You have no reach down to that tier 8. Who is that organization? You don't know either. It's just an indication that you might have a risk down there. And if I flip it over, Adriana, you're basically complied now to take action because you've identified a risk in tier 8. But it's going to be very hard to do that. So there's a lot of still challenges around there. And as a last one, maybe I also want to mention that just having a tech platform, and I'm shooting myself in the foot here to a certain degree, but just having a tech platform does not mean you're fully compliant and accountable. You can still publish a modern slavery statement that has zero substance with a few data points. And as I think, I can't remember who it was, there's no sort of benchmark. Even if you say, hey, this is my statement with a few data points, you're compliant as long as you hit those 7 criteria. So I'm going to keep it really short here today. I love tech platforms for obvious reasons, and they are definitely an enabler. But we need to have that human element in it, and I think that sort of flows partly into this challenge as well. We're talking about AI, but you still need that human oversight. You need to have that ground level engagement with NGOs on the ground, and you need to have enforcement mechanisms as well. So what happens, I'm sure other speakers will go into more details here as well, what happens when you do find an issue in your supply chain? So all of this has to play together. From our side, we just want to provide tech and bring all these data points together, and really excited to be part of this whole hackathon, because we're actually, and I'll be very selfish here, we're looking forward to working with some of you guys around how can we really effectively connect all these dots in a meaningful, significant way that will improve human lives on this planet. Because at the end of the day, let's not forget it. That's what it's all about. I mean, you can throw data at anything. It is to improve human lives on this planet. Love being part of this, and thanks for having us, Adriana. Over to you. And I think I stayed well below 10 minutes, but hopefully we'll have some cool questions to make up for it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicholas, and thank you for bringing this important perspective, and also this particular last slide of the human oversight. We, in our challenges, we have, and we're going to go in a lot of details tomorrow, really emphasize the importance of the explainability part of the AI models. We need to understand why the models decide what they decide. And the reason for that is because we want to provide that information to a human that will always be in the loop. And for us, these sessions are really helping us provide some potential users' perspective for the solutions that the teams are building. So thank you so much for mentioning this, and also helping us in a way advocate more why we're really caring so much about these features that we're asking the participants to build. And also for the final part, I think it's good to see that there is interest in not stopping with this hackathon, but also this hackathon being just a stepping stone into hopefully creating long-term partnerships and projects. So for all the teams out here, listen to this and really put your effort, because we are also excited to collaborate with you. And if your solutions are going to be good, hopefully we can collaborate beyond the scope of this hackathon. And now I want to invite Saskia. Saskia, you are working with such a complex industry, and your organization is helping these companies trying to address the issue of modern slavery. What are you seeing from your work? And tell us a little bit more about some of the lessons from your side. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Adriana, and thanks for having me. And I've seen lots of clapping hands at the end of the speakers. I would like the audience to also do some clapping hands for the organizers, because as a panelist, I've really enjoyed listening to all the other speakers so far and the synergies that we have. So there's going to be some overlap in terms of things that are said, and probably some of the things that are still coming today as well. So for example, Laureen mentioned the role of investors. Before I joined the Telco Together Foundation, I worked in financial services, similar to Nicholas, for over 17 years. So it's really, if anybody wants to touch up on the role of investors and social legislation and how they're thinking about financial risk, more than happy to talk about that as well in the Q&A. But in my current role, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm the CEO of the Telco Together Foundation. And as you can probably all know, being here, watching this from wherever you're dialing in all around the world, telecommunication can be immensely beneficial. But it also really brings out a lot of social complex challenges. And these challenges disproportionately affect vulnerable people. And the landscape of those challenges are changing quite quickly. So that from a telco perspective, they include things like domestic family and social violence, digital inclusion, but obviously also modern slavery, which is why we're here today. And from our point of view, no single issue or no single company can address this issue alone, because we're talking about really about a societal, global, social evil. So founded in 2011, the Telco Together Foundation really facilitates a collective industry approach to some of these social challenges. So it's a charitable foundation, but we do have members that sit across the telco industry. So anything like your carrier that you use the data through, your handset providers, but also your internet connections and data centers. And what we're really doing within the Telco Together Foundation is we've got a couple of what we call industry impact hubs. And those are what you could see as kind of a knowledge center, whereby we bring experts from within each organization together to focus on a particular topic. We started with our first modern slavery roundtable back in 2019. So that was really quite shortly after the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act. And that was really because there was a shared understanding of the role that the telco sector plays within modern slavery and how it's connected to modern slavery. And I know, Charlotte, I think everybody will quote your numbers throughout all of the session, but as the Global Slavery Index pointed out, in Australia alone, electronics account for roughly 9 billion of imported goods that have a high risk of exposure to modern slavery. And a large part of that is incorporated in the telco industry. And there's also over 70,000 people that are employed in these sectors and more than 40 billion from annual revenue. So quite big numbers that we're talking about. But the telco sector also provides what I call a dual sword. So it's also essential, and I think we'll hear more about that later today as well. It also plays an essential role in some of the solutions to modern slavery. Like all the data that we're talking about from AI sits in the data centers. If we talk about worker voice and tech solution, a lot of that goes through the telco sector as well. So when we started the working group at the Telco Together Foundation, one of the first things to do was try to identify, similar to what we've heard earlier, what are the unique risk exposures to modern slavery for the telco sector. So things that you can think about is the overseas call centers. So a lot of Australian telcos have call centers that are located in India or located in the Philippines. And you saw particularly during the global pandemic when borders were closed, that there were some really challenging working conditions in the call center. So for example, in certain countries, workers were not allowed to leave the call centers that they were working at as a result of the lockdown policies, but that also meant that your workers were in their office environment, to put it quite bluntly, sort of semi-locked up. So that created some really challenging working environments. The There's also a misunderstanding between legislation and working practices and worker rights that quite often get lost when you've got multinational global organizations. But another aspect for the telco perspective is the constructions and the maintenance of data centers and activities, but also the laying of cables. So everything that goes through the ground, there's a lot of construction work involved that keeps the telco sector going on a day-to-day basis. And those are some of the areas that potentially have a higher risk to worker exploitation practices. And then one that a lot of people are familiar with and that receive a lot of attention at the moment are the minerals and the materials that are essential in our telecommunication equipment. So the one that receives a lot of focus at the moment is conflict minerals, and particularly those that are coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there have been significant reports all around the world about very young children, but also migrant workers and others being exploited underground in some pretty horrific conditions. So if you're not familiar with that, any quick Google search will give you some stories that are really heartbreaking. So as we're thinking about some of those challenges and also that being connected to some of the solutions, our members came together and tried to see what can we do as an industry that really helps us address some of the challenges that are the result of modern slavery. So one of the first things that the group did, or that Telco Together did, was bring a working group together. So within our members, we work with certain members on climate change, but we work with certain members on domestic violence. And then we also established a working modern slavery working group. So that had a lot of members from legal and compliance, but also from procurement teams being involved. And the idea was really, and this is similar to what Nicholas mentions, is to facilitate that peer-to-peer learning. Modern slavery is a complex issue to address for any organization. I think Claire highlighted some of that as well. So open and frank conversations around what are the challenges and how you address those in a collaborative environment, but bringing also competitors together because they're facing similar challenges has been something that has been really valued by our members. The second thing we did was to develop a leadership statement on human rights and modern slavery. And that was to help elevate the conversation of the importance of modern slavery within the member organizations. So modern slavery and the adhering to the legal requirements and the drafting of the reports, sometimes it sits with a procurement team, sometimes it sits with a legal and compliance team. Yes, there's board oversight, but how do you actually ensure that there's a proper conversation happening at the senior level within a corporate environment? So we worked with the CEOs to draft, let's call it a statement of intent, to really make sure that the most senior level of the large telecom company in Australia committed to addressing the issue of modern slavery. And that can then have that positive trickle-down effect to make sure that those who are actually working on the implementation of the practices and the procedures have the right allocated resources that they need to roll out their programs. The third thing we did was develop a handbook, which is called a Pathway to Respecting Human Rights and Addressing Modern Slavery. And that was recognizing that within our membership base, we have quite a diverse group, both in terms of what they do, but also in terms of size. But recognizing that there is that difference within size, some of the challenges are shared challenges. So we really wanted to give those with potentially less resources internally guidance in terms of how they could think about addressing modern slavery. Again, learning from each other what the shared pathways are and how you can think about addressing the challenges in your supply chain as well as in your own operations. And that leads me to the fourth initiative that we've been working on, which is a supplier self-assessment questionnaire. So you hear quite often that companies will go to their suppliers and get their suppliers to answer a set of questions. Our members obviously have a very large overlap in terms of who they're sourcing their products from. So we thought that would be in the best interest of both the members as well as in their tier 1 suppliers to have a standardized set of questions. This makes the process easier on both sides, and it ensures that consistency in terms of the data that's being asked for, as well as in the data that's being reported. So these are some of the 4 initiatives that we've been working on over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, I think that that is not enough. There is a need for continuous improvement. Hopefully, the Modern Slavery Act will get strengthened over the coming year. And we are very excited to continue working with our members to make sure that there's that continuous improvement in both their practices internally, as well as working with their supply chain, because there's fact that there's still this many people who are a victim of modern slavery in this day and age is something simply that is incomprehensible. I thank everybody who's participating in the hackathon to come up with some really interesting data insights that hopefully I can take back to my members to help move that conversation forward. Thank you, Adriana, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Saskia, and thank you for emphasizing once again that businesses are not alone on this, and on top of the consortiums that Nicholas has mentioned, there are also these incredible foundations such as yours who are having all these different initiatives trying to help bring businesses together and help them in their journey of addressing modern slavery. But importantly here is really this this perspective that you brought in the in showcasing that technology could be has this duality of being a force for good, but also having so many risks. And I think it's very important for our participants here to understand this, because when they are technologies, they are experts in data science and AI, and every time you are developing something, you need to bring in this ethical and responsible development lens, so you ensure that the technology that you are putting out there is not by a miss of ethical assessment ends up to being used for doing bad. So thank you so much, Saskia, for bringing that perspective. And we are excited to also have Hannah with us today. Hannah, you are a technologist. You are you have a PhD in computer science, but you've dedicated your career in working against human trafficking. And I know your work is really sitting at this intersection between technology and forced labor, child labor, modern slavery at large, as defined here in Australia. So tell us a little bit about your work. What do you do, and what are some interesting projects that you're working on? But also tell us more about the data, how it is to work with data and build technology in this field. Thank you.
So much. And I think I've got the best spot on the panel because I can pick up on things that everyone's been talking about. So hi everyone. So as Adriana said, I'm the tech nerd on the panel. I've been working in the space of tech for transparency and accountability since for 20 years now. And now work in private sector for a company called DigiNext. We develop tools to support businesses to identify exploitation in their supply chain. Previously, I led a research group at UNU, United Nations University. It's a research think tank that undertakes research on behalf of member states and UN bodies. There, I led a group since 2016, looking exactly at tech against trafficking. If I try and categorize the work I've been doing, I think it's easiest to look at it around the 3 Ps in the anti-trafficking policy. So that's prevention, protection, and prosecution. I think it's good to keep this in mind because it helps us understand what was the purpose of what we're doing for each of these. If I think of protection, that's where most of my work has always been. In protection, we look at identifying victims and remediating harm. So most of my work has been in this space. Nicholas mentioned on one of his slides on the problem people have with worker voice tools. Worker voice tools are used in supply chains to help you understand the working conditions, to give workers a voice using technology. He mentioned low uptake in many cases due to fear of retaliation, lack of access to tools, and problems with language. I started working in the space of victim identification using worker voice tools Yes, that was in 2017, and I developed a tool called the Prize that's been used since then to give over 410,000 workers a chance to report the exploitative conditions that they face at work. By design, our research started on the ground to understand what technology did people have access to, what problems they faced, and how they thought technology could help them. So really grounded in the reality of workers there. Through this process of about a year of co-designing this system, I developed this tool, Prize, which is an audio-first tool to help workers in supply chains, really, to anonymously and privately disclose the conditions of work that they face. We designed specifically for semi-literate workers because we knew that could be a problem that these workers faced. Definitely, we knew that people who interface with them, whether it's an NGO, a police officer, a labour inspector, or a private auditor, they often won't speak the same language as the workers. So everything in it, we wanted to overcome problems with lack of translators, for example, so that a worker would understand the questions they're being asked. They could privately signal that they wanted help, or also they could privately signal that, well, yes, I am being exploited, but I'd rather stay here than go and have no job. So that was a bit about the agency of the workers there. So since we started with a prize, we've developed quite a few sets of questions to help to identify exploitative working conditions. We've got a generic question set, which we call conditions at work, which is basically for any kind of factory environment. But we also develop sector-specific sets because the way people are exploited in tea picking, for example, or sugarcane harvesting, or seafood processing, or fishing is very different because of the context that they're in. So we support businesses to, first of all, map their supply chain to understand who their tier 1 suppliers are. We help them to then invite their tier 1 suppliers to invite their tier 1 suppliers to the system, and then we trickle down the supply chain that way. That's with our tool called Lumen. So we first trickle down requests. Everyone so far has been talking about SAQs and all of that. So we also have our own SAQs in there, which gives has, again, sometimes sector-specific questions that we ask the different suppliers to answer. We also bring all of this information together because we understand really what's going on in a work environment. You need to have everybody's perspective. Our tool brings together the voice of the supplier, the recruiter, the labor provider, and we compare it against the worker's voice because we say, actually, we take the stance that the worker is our source of truth. They're telling us what the conditions are in their work environment, and then we'll compare everybody else's perspective to that to say, well, where's inconsistencies or somebody's lying in there. So that's what I say is like our protection kind of victim identification side. If you think about that, like 410,000 interviews, each interview has, say, between 20 and 40 questions. We've got a lot of data that we're sitting on here. Prosecution can happen when you know the patterns of exploitation that occur. So in that part, we are looking ourselves at the patterns of exploitation that are happening so that we can support in the policy part to make sure people know what's happening on the ground, so you can have better ways of gathering evidence that could be used, for example. For the third P, the prevention one, I think it was Clea and Saskia mentioned having, maybe it was just Saskia talking about, apologies, I can't remember who it was. One of them was talking about tools for getting better visibility of the supply chain and product traceability. So one of the tools that we've developed with funding from actually the Department of Labor in the US, we've developed tools to be able to map from raw material extraction to final product assembly and then onto the brand itself. So you can understand for this given product, where did it come from? It's a very labor-intensive process of mapping. I think it was actually Claire who talked about at the beginning they had that Excel spreadsheet that was in Chinese to find out where the solar panel components are from. So we've worked in Pakistan in cotton, and we were working in cobalt with the mines in the DRC. And so from there, looking at where from the farms to the ginners, for example, to the ginning mills where they take raw cotton into a bale, and then a bale into yarn, and then yarn into fabric, and the fabric is cut and sewed, et cetera, so we could have all of those producers mapping their purchases, their product transformations, and their sales. This is all, we'd call it document-based traceability, because you're looking at the document numbers, the invoices and things like that, as they go from one supplier to the next supplier. We've done some cool things there with physical traceability on top of that. So isotopic test and DNA testing and synthetic DNA testing. We use that. Let's think of, say, synthetic DNA testing. We would spray synthetic DNA onto the cotton at the ginning mill. So once they've cleaned it and they've got all the sticks out, you spray the DNA onto the cotton so that at the end, or any point actually in the supply chain, you can check and say, the document-based traceability says this product should have come from this ginning mill. Let's test the DNA of this cotton sample to see, did it actually happen? So that's where we put the verification part into our traceability tool. Across all of this stuff, whenever we're gathering information, and maybe this is linking back to what Adriana asked me to talk about there, was about data standardization. In our work, we align to the ILO indicators of forced labor that were introduced at the very beginning, just to make sure that we're collecting data that can be used by other people or other systems as well. So anytime you're working with data, it's really important to make sure the way you're collecting it, the way you're defining it, the standards that you're going against are used by other people and known by other people. Otherwise, your data will sit in a silo, and if nothing else, will need to be transformed to be able to be helpful for other people as well. I just wanted to point out that while technology really can help advance the cause and the fight against modern slavery, traffickers also use technology in their fight as well. So we need to make sure that when we design technology, we think of how it can be used, definitely, but also how can it be abused. Also need to think of things like data privacy. Things like excluding digitally illiterate users, or even just illiterate users. And all of these factors need to go in right from the beginning of design of technologies that you're going to be working on. I think I will leave it there. I tried to make it brief, Adriana.
That was great. Thank you all so much. We still have so much time for questions, so I'm really glad that you told us all of those important information and insights from your very rich and also very diverse experiences. So thank you for doing that. And I have lots of questions, and however, we have here also questions from one of our panelists, Laureen, and actually that's a question that I was actually embarrassed to ask, because I thought, oh, maybe I should know already by this point. But again, we're all learning here. And my question, simply put, is we ask these companies to push for transparency, and then in the report to be as transparent as possible. But can a company report in their Modern Slavery Act details about their suppliers beyond tier 1 or tier 2? And can they even get access from their tier 1 suppliers to the information about their tier 2 and beyond suppliers? Or is this getting into conflict with any competitions law and so on? But Laureen has put this in a lot nicer words in her question. So maybe, Laureen, I'll ask you to summarize your questions from the chat. I think they're going in a way in the same direction, but I'm so excited to learn from you. What's the answer to that?
Yeah, no, my question was going to Claire, because Claire, you mentioned that you have your solar panel, yeah, supply chain, and you ask all the suppliers to provide documentation so you know exactly what suppliers have been involved in the production of those solar panels. And we often try to get that kind of information, but we run into pushback from suppliers or even brands who say my suppliers don't want to, disclose this information even to me, or under special NDA clauses, non-disclosure agreements, just because it's commercially sensitive information. And this can be because who is your supplier is a competitive advantage, but it can also be because, there might be a middleman who doesn't want to get cut out. So yeah, I was wondering, is it common practice within solar panels specifically, or in your work in general, for suppliers to provide you that information? Or was it also quite a process to get them to participate in giving you that information? And yeah, how did you go about it? Did you run into pushback, and how did you deal with that? I hope that is a clear enough question.
Yeah, totally clear. No, thanks, Laureen. It's a really good question, and in short, maybe the answer is it varies. But I'll provide a bit more detail. So in the example of solar, I think in that sector in particular, there has been a real cultural shift in understanding that traceability is important in mitigating those risks, and in some cases, I wouldn't say the only step you can take, but certainly it's the first step, certainly within solar, because given the complex and kind of unique nature of the risks. So in our situation, we the first kind of set of panels as part of this process that we sourced came from a small distributor based in Australia that was then sourcing from a much larger international solar panel manufacturer. So our the work really in raising awareness was with the small distributor, our direct supplier. They actually had limited awareness of modern slavery risks. And I wouldn't say so much pushback, but just it was an awareness piece that we had to kind of get them on board with first, to then communicate to the larger manufacturer. The larger manufacturer, we didn't experience any pushback with them. They were quite aware of the risks that had requests like this previous, I think because of the legislative changes in the US with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which, specifically a lot of solar companies have been implicated with bans of solar panels into the US. And so that has, as Charlotte mentioned, driven a big push around supply chain traceability. So they were quite happy to provide that, although there is a cost, an additional cost for a fully traceable panel. So that's maybe the other thing to factor in, that, we couldn't just ask for this documentation. That's actually you're kind of sourcing a separate product in a sense, that's the fully traceable panel. But so I think that's maybe a little bit about the kind of attention, the spotlight that's been on solar. But just really briefly to share another experience, we work with Electronics Watch, which is a really excellent organisation for public entities in Australia, but also they deal a lot with across Europe and the UK. And they support worker-driven monitoring in the electronics supply chain, addressing not just modern slavery, but broader labour rights issues and helping to engage with companies and remediate those issues. So we are an affiliate of Electronics Watch and have been trying to do similar work around traceability with our ICT suppliers. And that's a totally different picture. We've had so much pushback there. It's been really challenging. All those commercial in confidence, competitive issues have come up around not wanting to share supplier details with us. Why do you need this information? What will you be using it for? So we've really made, in all honesty, very slow progress there in trying to get visibility compared to solar, where that was a kind of one question we asked and they were happy to provide it. So I think that's a little bit about there's not the similar legislation like there is in the US around electronics, or I guess that's electronics hasn't been targeted maybe in the same way that solar has been. That's maybe partly to account for it. But I think the other real big piece, which Nicholas touched on a lot, was around the benefits of engaging at this at a sector level through a consortium. And, you know, I think that's the way we really need to move, that suppliers shouldn't be getting these requests from multiple buyers, but that we need to have a coordinated approach around, you know, why supply chain visibility is important. And we should be doing that kind of on a sector or a multi-stakeholder basis. That then makes it, you know, suppliers feel maybe more comfortable in sharing that because they understand it's a common request across buyers. I'll leave it there. Others might have thoughts on that as well.
Perfect. Is there any take on that, or can I follow up with a question? Okay,
I'm happy.
Yeah,
You go.
Saskia, please.
So unfortunately, it wasn't successful, and that was due to, quite ironically, data issues and security related issues. But before I joined Telco Together, there was actually an initiative to start up a joint supplier platform. And the only reason that I did want to mention that is that to me, that indicated that there is an interest to work collaboratively. And I think that that speaks to the question around commercial sensitivity in terms of sharing supplier information. So from the Telco Together perspective, there was the initiative, there was the willingness. It made it quite far, but unfortunately, due to data security issues where the data was stored, we weren't able to execute the project.
I might just jump in on that one. That's an interesting one because we had one sector, and I won't mention which one it is, but they had similar challenges. And there are ways of quarantining certain information. And most of the data that is collected is not typically commercially sensitive. And if an organization does want to push in their procurement spend and do some analytics on that, that's technically, it's very possible these days. So you can have that shared pool of commercially not sensitive information, ensure it doesn't go offshore, and that's quite easy to do as well, but then make sure that the quarantine bits are not visible to everyone. So those models, technically, it's doable, and we're doing it with one of the consortium. I won't mention which one because they have very competitive aspects despite collaborating.
Perfect. Thank you. And a question for all the panelists, maybe bringing it back to simple terms, why do businesses care? Why would a business want to move beyond compliance and really look into this issue? What is the motivation or the drive for a business to really try to lead their industry in the response to these legislations?
Yeah, I think, sorry, if you don't mind if I chime in. I was chatting to a company earlier today, and I think, sorry, the lighting's terrible. It's almost like a bit of a funny chicken and an egg situation, because after companies have to care about this issue, so legislation has come in and they now have to care about this issue enough to at least write a report on it, then they can see that, oh, actually, maybe those practices weren't as helpful. Like, even if it's just our own purchasing practices, maybe they were driving unhelpful sort of demands on workers. So a lot of companies now I hear talking about their own values and being value-led, which I think is a really awesome change to see. So from there, businesses can basically go anywhere. Somebody I was talking to today, he was saying like they hire a lot of blue-collar workers, and there's like such a demand for working there. Like, people really value having work as a security guard, for example, in Singapore, because they know at this particular company they're always going to be paid on time, or one other is operations, like employees have to get a scooter to get to work safely, so they now offer like micro loans so that their workers can buy scooters to get to work. So I think it becomes like this creative problem that you're trying to find solutions to for some companies, and they then it's just like values led, and it continues to snowball in a good way from there. Just some thoughts.
Thank you. Are there any other comments on these
Yeah,
questions?
I'd like to just add to it just slightly, if that's okay, just from a business perspective that has, the industries we work in is that it's exactly that continuous improvement model, but not just from a business perspective, it's from, the people that are within the business, because part of understanding risk is understanding it, recognizing it, reporting on it, and then working out the mechanisms to change it and educating everybody in your organization at particular levels to understand what those risks are. And then that can start to move risk into an opportunity space. And it also allows businesses, for example, if we're looking from a procurement perspective at your suppliers, your tier one suppliers, and then looking at the types of products that you're getting from those suppliers, and then understanding who is interested in the initiatives and values that you have as an organization, then that can start to assist the business to grow in a direction that's beneficial, as I was saying before when I was talking, that's beneficial for our people, but also, others in our supply chain. So it is that continuous improvement model, and it stems from understanding more about your organization. And sometimes it does come from, a legislation expecting you to learn something more around reporting for your organization, but that can only be a benefit to everybody. And you heard my story about how difficult it was to sort of wrap my head around the things that we needed to do and how we needed to do them. But everyone in our organization has gone through that in some way by learning about this and continuing to learn about this from the programs that we put in place. And we will continue to put additional programs in place and be more curious and try to work with partners to continue to, assess and address this risk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clea. And maybe as we have 5 minutes left, I have 2 points that I would like to ask the speakers. So maybe we can take 1 minute each. So you can address both of them or one of them as you see fit. But the 2 points are, what are your what do you see as being challenges of opportunities in developing AI solutions to assess the modern slavery statements, or to help governments respond to this and enforce these legislations? And secondly, any piece of advice for the participants as they're embarking in this wonderful long weekend for them, hacking at these statements, and anything that you think they should be aware of? I'll pass it to Laureen, and then maybe we can go one after another after this. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief. There's a lot to say on this, but I hope it will also be useful for the hackathon that's coming. So challenges are obviously the easiest to start with. One is the metadata for the documents. So what year do you assign to a document if they're running, with a financial year in Australia that starts in June, July, in Europe, that's often March or January. So if you're needing to assign one particular year to a document, you need to make methodological decisions on that, and you need to program that into AI systems, which can be quite complex. And companies will also maybe say, this is my 2025 statement because I published it in 2025, but it actually covers the 2024 data when they collected it. So it's this kind of things that can be very complex. It's also things like, what company are we really looking at? They need to have actually IDs, because as I mentioned earlier, names don't always get you accurate, matches. So if you're looking at companies between all these different data sets, you really need an ID. So that's something that we often look for in these documents, but which in modern slavery statements is often not there. Then we also have modern slavery statements have a particular issue with machine readability, because documents in particular the early years had to be signed and were often signed manually. So pages were scanned in, so they were images rather than PDFs that you could parse the text for. Sometimes the entire document, sometimes just the last page, where there's also some interesting information. So it's this kind of challenges that you run into. And then, legal language with double negatives, talking around the point, having things referring to lots of different paragraphs, which a human brain can comprehend, but a machine has a really hard time untangling. Even though we all think, AI is much more intelligent than we are, we're not there yet. And And then also, I would say what is also quite unique with this particular documents is that if you're looking at cases of modern slavery reported, this is often not talked about in these statements. So what does it look like when they find modern slavery? Did they find modern slavery? There's so little reporting on that there's not enough data for any machine to be trained on what that looks like. How should they recognize that type of information? So you cannot actually find it with a machine. So in the end, with Project AIMS, one of the big things we also constantly had to tell people was, the AI can help us find if there might be some relevant information to this particular question in this document and where you might be able to find it. Is it page 2 of 36 or 136, or is it, somewhere else? But it's not going to tell you the answer to your actual question. That needs the human intelligence still. So I hope that maybe answers both questions in one. It's challenges, but it's things to keep in mind as you start to hack your way through all of these documents.
Excellent. Clea, you're next on my screen. Any final thoughts?
Well, I'm not a hackathon professional, Adriana, really. I'm more from a risk perspective, but I think that challenges would be just trying to find out exactly what you want to focus on, because you've got quite a short period of time to prepare whatever it is that you're going to prepare for this hackathon. And I think just be mindful that there will be people, whatever you produce, there will be people like me who are not data scientists and don't have PhDs in mathematics that need to be able to utilize the system in some way. So just keep that in mind, depending on which stream you're working in.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Yeah, I think as well, I don't know, I don't have heaps of the technical understanding of things, but I guess my advice would be, as you create solutions, it will be incredible to make things more efficient or to simplify processes or paperwork, anything like that. But if you can also keep in mind that lens of the ultimate goal is to have an impact on workers and for workers to be safe, then hopefully that helps motivate you and helps put things in their place. Thanks.
Perfect. Saskia?
I think this data has so much potential, and as you're working your way through it, think about who you're trying to provide a solution for. Is it for the practitioners on the corporate side to help them develop better statements? Or is it for the data services who actually analyze lots of statements? Or is it for NGOs who are trying to identify what is happening? Keep your audience in mind as you're designing your solutions, and good luck.
Thank you. Nicholas?
Well, talking to you, Adriana, I always knew that AI and integrating AI is going to be very complicated. Laureen's added some extra layers of complication there, but despite that, I'm really excited at the potential of AI coming in and doing a lot of those manual, very tedious tasks, like analyzing a 240-page audit report on a supplier or something like that, and just pulling out the key data. And I guess the challenge to the participants would be that we develop an efficient kind of single source of truth that takes SAQs, that takes workers' voice, AI, and third-party data sets, whatever, and brings it all together, but allows the users then to sort of be that human in the loop. I always have to bring up the human in the loop to sort of put their own sort of risk filters over it. That's the ideal sort of nirvana, that we have that single source of truth where it all comes together in one, but you have that human in the middle that still controls it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Claire?
From a challenge, I would say consider the difference of compliance versus impact. So when you're talking about an AI solution reading modern slavery statements, they're not the same thing. And there has been quite a lot of criticism, as I'm sure you've heard from earlier sessions, around compliance with the Modern Slavery Act doesn't necessarily mean meaningful change for people in modern slavery. So how can AI help us to assess if there's impact within those statements, not just compliance with the legislation? And then my one piece of advice, which I think pulls on what others have said, is around keeping people front and center throughout the hackathon. We use, even today, you know, I caught myself saying we use so many acronyms. We say risk mitigation, we use terms like due diligence, you know, we get caught up in processes, but really all of this work is about how can we make positive changes for people that are living in modern slavery. So come back to that question throughout the hackathon.
Thank you. And Hannah, back to you for your final remarks. And just mentioning, Hannah will be with us a lot throughout tomorrow as well, as she has been one of the main contributors to this project as well. So you're going to hear a lot more from her tomorrow.
I was going to say, from my experience over the last few months of marking up quite a few of the modern slavery statements, there is no thing is one modern slavery statement. They're all different. They have all different types of data, and many of them don't. I think someone said they don't tell you what you want to know. You have to navigate all of the different terminology. So when you're testing whatever you're making, make sure it works for more than just one very specific statement, because it won't work at the end.
Thank you. Absolutely, Hannah. And we have a lot of those details to discuss tomorrow in some of the challenges.